have been excited about this project, and we just wanted to kind of reiterate at the very beginning, we think there's a lot of credibility to this. You can roll it forward. Credibility to this project that is not typical of the ones that have often been done. Well, one is this is a 2-year study. This is multi-approach, multi-step through this. We've looked at it from a micro level and a macro level, and so I think that kind of sets it outside of the ones that can often be done for these economic impact studies. Also, there is over 3 decades of experience doing these kind of studies on this team. It's a little skewed toward Roy versus me, and I promised him I wouldn't talk about his age, and he promised me that he wouldn't talk about my youth and inexperience. So we'll move on to. There's also some standard techniques. A lot of people are very comfortable with the techniques that we've used with IMPLAN, but there's also some innovations too. It incorporated a lot of qualitative factors, a lot of interviews. It also looked at a lot of different inputs from NRHA and some data that's not usually considered in some of these programs. We've also have looked at almost all the stakeholders that we could think of, and anybody that had come forth that said that they wanted to have input into this process. We have talked to them and tried to incorporate their ideas into this. The New York Authority has had interest in this study. The Virginia Port Authority has made public statements that they prefer this approach to other approaches. And St. Louis presentation went very well and was well received. So I think that there should be a lot of confidence. And when you use this, and the press has been kind too and have been very interested in the findings to the study. So for all these reasons, I think that going forward, just from the interest, the approach, and the amount of the number and the people that have had input to this is positive. So foundation for the future too. This is one is I think it's important when you're going into this into the strategy process this year to know that the mission statement that you had put forth was supported. I mean, that's a great place to start. You're not reinventing yourself. You're not trying to change dramatically who you are. The feedback was not only are you doing the right things, but you're doing the right things well. And so that's a nice place to be from a planning perspective, to know that you're trying to refine and improve, not to dramatically change what you are. The report supports both your strategic plan going forward and some of the other plans that have been done. The plan Norfolk 2030 is supported by this, and also the Architects Unlimited report also seems to be very consistent with the findings that we've had too. From what you do well, it's project oriented, and so looking at it from a project standpoint, Central Brambleton, your ability to change the social infrastructure is an important factor that needs to be considered in your next strategic plan. This is very difficult to do. Most culture changes are looked at over decades and very difficult for anybody to pull off, but you seem to be equipped to do that well.
As you pointed out, HUD has been testifying they're switching fully to the project approach. And that is very much in line with your thinking, the way you've been doing your activities.
So, and there's also great benefits not only in the project that you take on, but the spillover effects too. And so talking about the neighboring locations that also have positive effects on this. And you're a critical partner. And if you look at all the people that you partnered with and have benefited from your actions, I mean, both the local and federal governments, builders, renters, taxpayers, residents, recipients, all those. And I think that this study should help you in the future to assist you in decision making. So I'm going to turn it over to Roy a little bit more specifically to talk about some of the HCV and public housing.
You had asked last time for a comparison on the housing choice vouchers and the public housing. Go ahead. We put together some numbers. Wanted to talk first about, okay, who are the people we're talking about? I mean, we found very interesting that The age, yes, in the housing choice vouchers, these are people in mainly single-family homes or semi-detached buildings, and a little bit older, 46 median age as well as 46 average age. A little bit younger group in the PHA group, although you notice the average and the median are different because you have 5 of the elderly and disabled units in the PHA, the public housing, out of the 11 units. So that tends to skew it to a little higher average age. I found it interesting, your oldest head of household, though, and this is all head of household information, your oldest head of household is in the mid-90s in each case. And the youngest, though, you have some heads of household who are 19 out there. In your public housing units, 20 was the youngest one age in the housing choice vouchers. The next one, when we looked, we were interested in your views on, are they certified for disability allowances and disability insurance? That you would think they would be mainly in the PHA because you have units for the elderly and the disabled. We found it kind of interesting that actually 36%, over a third of those in the Housing Choice Voucher program are certified for disability. And there's a wide range of what counts and what is included in the disability. But we found that a fairly interesting difference on there. The other feature, currently employed, and this is heads of household only, not total members in the housing unit, but in the PHA group, public housing group, it was 43%, a little less than half. It wasn't that much higher. It was only 45% looking at the housing choice vouchers. This was from the data that was supplied to us on what were the number of them actually getting wages. And that wasn't, of course, the total income. The households had income from a variety of sources, but were they actually employed in the fiscal year 2010? And it was only 45%, which we found a little interesting. So there are some substantial differences, but overall not as much difference in the demographics of the people as you might expect. But when you get to income, there is a substantial difference. You have the averages we've shown you before for the public housing units, 2.7 average number of people in the household with a 14,000, almost 500 income. And yes, it's a higher income, actually a slightly lower household size when you look at the housing choice voucher population. It's the same range though, 1 to 11 people in those housing units. What we find kind of interesting, my view going into it, you usually think, especially of public housing, as being fairly large, and people, families maybe with 2 or 3 children, 4 or 5 people in the household. You'll notice for the public housing group, half of the people in your public housing units are either a single person or 2 people. That it's not mainly broader families, it's not mainly the 2.7 average or 3 people average even. And you have nearly half of the households who are in the Housing Choice Voucher program are ones that are either just 1 person or 2 people in the household. So a somewhat smaller household size as the dominant size of the units than I expected, anyway, looking at the data. And that brings up, as I said earlier, okay, there's only 1,052, 45% of the heads of household who are employed, because we had separate figures for both the PHA and the HCV on members versus heads of household. And we have cases here, for instance, where you have a head of household who's not employed, but you'll have, there's one case, 2 members in the household who are employed. So we're not saying the household There were actually, under the HCV, there were 1,227 members and heads of household who were employed. This was just the number of the heads who were employed. We were comparing apples and apples in that case. Okay, the next view, moving to NRH, the public housing program. And this one, I apologize for all the numbers here, but as you know, I'm a numbers guy and I wanted to give you the whole set of numbers here. We've got it by the household size. As you can see, the income averages there. There's quite a wide range of incomes for the different household sizes, as you would expect. From the single person households down there with an average income of $10,000, and then you get up to the larger households, you've got incomes more than twice that for the household size, which you need in order to be providing for the necessities even for these particular households. What we're emphasizing in that top part, though, was what we were talking about last time. What we did in looking at this, we were looking at impacts. So we looked at the impact on the people who are your tenants. And what we were looking at there then is, okay, how much the tenant is paying to you, and what is your assessment, based on the HUD guidelines, of the market value of the unit they're living in. So what you have here, this I think was partly a point of confusion, what you have here is the average market value of the units by household size in there. This isn't money you are spending. This is the value of the units they're living in versus what they are paying you in order to be living in those units. What we're talking about, though, is gross rent. And the gross rent in the HUD formula is, it's not just the shelter rent. It also is the basic utilities that you're looking at, which comes into play with the housing choice voucher, as well as, of course, you are providing the utilities, generally basic utilities, with the public housing. So, what we were looking at last time, the benefit, we emphasized the difference. What difference do you make to people and to the community? So here we were looking at what difference you were making for the individual. We said in the report and last time, well, they're living in a unit, shelter and basic utilities, that has a value of $6,090 on an annual basis. That would be the annual cost, rent, in an open market for renting it and the basic utilities. What they're actually paying you is less than half that, $3,000. So at the minimum, looking at a in-kind benefit to the tenant households, at the minimum, you're providing an in-kind benefit of $3,800 to those individuals. So that was part of what we were looking at. What do you do for the individuals in providing shelter and some basic utilities? However, what we modeled for the looking at what's the impact on the city was quite different. What we were modeling as the impact on the city is, okay, what are you spending versus what would they be spending if there was no NRHA? And we got the estimates, we did the estimates of what they would be spending using federal data. They have very good data on what people of different household size and different income categories spend on just about anything you want to name. Because think about it, you have to know that for the Consumer Price Index. That Consumer Price Index isn't just a list of prices. You have to weight it by how much people would spend on those goods to get an overall index. So you have very detailed data that's collected actually very regularly on what do individuals of different family size, different income levels spend on housing, utilities, and all sorts of individual down to what are they buying hair dryers, for instance. You can get some great data on all the different products people buy. So we can come up with a pretty good estimate of what would the people with an average income of $14,000 be spending for the rent and for housing and utilities if there was no NRHA. And now they wouldn't be renting something of the same quality as what you're providing for them. They are living in smaller units and sometimes sharing with other families. So this is not what they would spend for an equivalent shelter and utilities. So we're looking at, okay, we thought they would have spent better than $3,000 on shelter and utilities if you weren't around. However, looking at the average direct spending for the public housing units, you're actually spending more than what would be the fair market rent of just shelter and utilities. You're actually spending close to $9,000 per unit. Now, what you have in here, think about it, you have $4.5 million worth of just support services in helping these people and in providing counseling support with these families. So this is including more than just the shelter and the utilities that you provide. But so this is what you're actually spending. And what we had in those impact studies that create, this is the direct spending per household. That's what we actually modeled as to what creates jobs in the city that wouldn't have existed otherwise. We're saying take the amount you spent minus what the people, they would have still been living here, what they would have spent anyway. And this is your direct impact in the city. And we can model how that creates jobs, creates output for other businesses in the area. What it doesn't include is the capital expenditures. That because this was operations, we're saying what do you do for the people who are actually living in these units? And the capital expenditures of remodeling or building it with nobody in there is not a direct benefit to the individual. So we bring that in the next page. That's something we didn't have in the data we showed you in December. And that's literally what makes the PHA program actually cost a little more per unit. Because you've got all these units, $200 million worth of buildings that you have to maintain and remodel, upgrade, replace over the life of the building. We did the same thing for the HCV, the Housing Choice Vouchers, where you have the numbers by household size, and moving more quickly through it, we're talking about a $16,000, a couple $1,000 higher income. And that moves the people, though, up into a whole higher range when you look at national spending by the consumers and by households, is why the estimate here we're looking at, well, they would still be spending about a little more on actual rent. They're actually spending more on utilities too, because they would be living in a little better quality housing if they weren't, if you didn't exist. What we didn't have, though, in the Housing Choice Voucher there, we were looking at what you were paying the people who own the units, the houses. Okay, we had to add back in your administration on that, which we had modeled separately in the HCV report. You report $2 million spent on administration of the Housing Choice Vouchers, checking that the property is what it says it is, meets the HUD quality standards, other features on the program. So adding that back in, we're saying, okay, our first pass on looking at this, answering the question you were asking, is you're spending at least $8,500 on that.
Lessons learned. Well, I think, in looking at the project we've done so far, I think there is a lot of benefit, both from NRHA and from an ability to look forward to some of the other projects. If you look at Central Brambleton, the kind of things we learned there and how to apply that in the future, I think those lessons hold up very well for Broad Creek and the St. Paul's area. The concerns that we might have going forward, one is just the uncertainty. I think that's the bigger part of it. We're not sure what's going to happen. Some of the discussion that we had with the budget, the HUD's budget, and all those kind of things, those are just going to be increasingly difficult, not only from that perspective, but just the complexity of implementing your mission becomes more difficult with the loss of eminent domain in many respects, with funding difficulties, with moving from dominantly federal funding to having to look for alternative sources. Consolidation of some of the programs looks to be the latest discussion of, it's going to take a lot more partnerships. And that's one of your strengths. You are very good at creating good partnerships, solid partnerships that help you move forward and accomplish your mission. But that's increasingly going to become a question that you're going to have to ask of who else can we get alongside us to pull this together. And the demands of being a thought leader. I think right now you have a national audience that is interested in doing what you do. Broad Creek has gotten people coming out and looking at this. Some of the presentations we've made and some of the interests we've had on the study is people looking for creative ideas. And there's difficulty in being a thought leader, but there's some benefits of that also. So I think much of this plays into your strengths. I mean, there's an ability to plan, to be creative with your partnerships, and to be successful in many ways. But with the uncertain environment, there's going to be some additional capabilities that you're going to have to push forward. Let me push that one. So part of this is just selling what you do well. And one of the things this study hopefully gives you is a way of talking about what is your return on investment. And some of that is in numbers, and some of that is in just the quality of life that you're offering, not only the residents in these communities, but the taxpayers and the city itself. And so walking through that and trying to figure out, okay, here's what we offer to the city, and making sure that there's a coherent, consistent message out there. And one of those, 1,149 jobs in 2010. That's an impressive number. I mean, if you look at those jobs would not be here, and those jobs are paying on average more than $46,000 a year. So if part of this, if you went away, obviously those jobs would not be here. But it's other than that too. It's the downstream jobs too, to support the people that are here, the services and the products that they're buying. And it's, you're housing Norfolk's most vulnerable citizens, and you're attracting and keeping those people that many of the businesses need to work in their businesses. And you've added significantly to Norfolk's stability and vibrancy. And so that, again, supports some of the planning that's going on in the city, some of the other things that you're trying to pull off here. And you've increased the total assessed value for new homeowners. And if you look at just the one project we looked at, Central Brambleton, there's a 501% increase in their home values between 2001 and 2010. And so some of that came from physical infrastructure, but it also came from changing the nature, the culture, and the vibrancy of those neighborhoods. And so I think that not only are you benefiting the people that are living there, but the tax base too has increased significantly. And so the city has benefited greatly from your work here. 93% of that money is staying here, and that's an incredible number. Have you seen numbers like that before?
No.
Just in one city where the impact is all here. So the money here stays here, and then is.
But you're not selling products outside the city. You are working with people here. The benefits are here. The spending is here.
Right.
So it's a much higher impact than a manufacturing company would have, for example.
And I think, again, there's a recognition that the work ahead of you is even more exciting and more transformational than the work you've already done. I mean, it looks like the Broad Creek is pulling together all the assets, all the capabilities, all the pieces come together in a Broad Creek like no other place can pull off. Move forward. Finally, just some other implications. One is just because of the numbers we've seen, where 3% are transferring from public housing to housing choice vouchers, there may be some motivations for you to move them in that direction, but it doesn't look like there's a clear path. You know, how do you, there's lots of programs, there's lots of pieces there, and so I think trying to develop a clear path for individual self-sufficiency. It looks like all the pieces are there, but how do you do that? How specifically is that pulled off? And I think that's, you know, it's a huge problem that no one solved, and so that's one of those issues that needs to be moved through. How do people move from one circumstance into self-sufficiency? This third point is stabilizing influence of HCV and pH, public housing. That is another thing you do well. I mean, you're hitting on all cylinders on stabilization of neighborhoods, bringing those up, reducing crime. All those things are working well, and that should explicitly be played out in the planning and strategy. And finally, just the long-range foresight function, trying to understand what is going to happen in the future. That's always difficult for large organizations to understand in an uncertain environment how that's pulled off. Then integrating the things that you do well is important. Here's what we do. How do we integrate that in that path and figure out how we're best able to position ourselves in the future? And then just capabilities to thrive even when you can't plan perfectly. I mean, just embracing uncertainty and understanding where you're at in the uncertainty so that you can still perform at the highest level and not be afraid of the difficulties, but looking out and making the best of the situations you find yourself in. Roy will finish us up with just a little bit about what that looks like in the future from a planning standpoint.
Oh, okay. We were asked to look a little bit more at how you might use this in your long-range planning. So you have a plan to 2017, 5 years out, but when you're looking 5 years or especially anything more, you can't assume the status quo, that the approach that we would recommend is looking at what the companies like Shell and a lot of the European governments and all look, strategic foresight, that what you're doing is thinking more about the future and what it will be like, that you're looking at multiple possibilities for the future, usually 3 to 4 scenarios. Shell is famous for that, for instance. They published in the early 70s a scenario for what would happen if the oil-producing countries got together in a cooperative group as OPEC, and how would we respond. They also had scenarios for, in the 1980s, for the Soviet Union collapsing, since they have big oil and gas reserves. And they had strategies prepared. They had thought about it. What would we do if the Soviet Union disintegrated? And so, look, and now it's become even more necessary, I think, to do that kind of thinking because things are changing so fast. If you just look at the changes in the last decade, how people live, how people work, the social media, you didn't have Facebook and Twitter and all of these interconnections even 10 years ago. Google didn't, you can look at their first web page was in December of '98. And it was just a little beta temporary thing up there. So things change very rapidly. And it's useful to be looking at it, but looking at it in a perspective of, okay, what could the future look like in a multidimensional view? So it's a much broader mindset. You're saying you're not going to look at just housing. You're going to look at demographics. You're going to look at economics. You're going to be looking at how government is changing. It's changing right now. What will government be like? What will HUD be like in 5 years or 10 years from now? And some different scenarios. So you're not predicting, forecasting that that's what's going to happen. You're looking at, here are some plausible possibilities and how these pieces fit together. And what would we do strategically if that took place? So the way I look at it, a lot of people look at it, I've worked with strategic planning with some groups, companies, and also public groups. And usually they're starting with, here's a mission and here's the goals. Now, what are we going to do? It's the bottom part. They don't think enough about the top part. the strategic thinking, what's the external environment really going to be like in 5 years or 10 years? And really putting themselves into looking at the possible situations where they are going to be in and have to make decisions. That strategic foresight is really the strategic thinking, looking at the options. How will the environment be? What are the options? Then looking at your strategies, and then finally coming down to an actual plan. What are we going to do? But I did this with CIT many years ago, and I've done it with others and hospitals and others. That usually there's too much emphasis here of saying, okay, let's decide what we're going to do, rather than thinking about just what could the environment be like. So, next one, please. So, the foresight, strategy, and planning, we really say it's the strategic thinking process. It changes the way you think about what it's going to be like and what might happen. And that leads you to, okay, if we think this is possible, thinking of signposts. Shell likes to talk about their signpost, which they use all the way down to the product and region level. We have these 4 scenarios, so what are the signs we're moving towards any one of them? And if they see themselves moving towards one of those options, then they'll adopt a strategy to respond to that. But they're keeping on the lookout for how we're moving in a direction towards one of those possibilities. And this is all very general that we're talking about. I actually teach a class in strategic foresight, which starts next Tuesday. And I taught it all last year. The next one is one of the students in teams of 2 do projects where they write scenarios for an issue or a general situation, and then additional scenarios on how they would live and work in that environment. And this one was a student future of cities matrix that they put together. And you have demographic and technology issues considered in here too, but the main 2 axes they were looking at, to separate it into 4, was urbanization versus deurbanization. You hear a lot about, okay, we're moving towards super cities, but there are forces in the other direction too. We have agencies here in Virginia, the Virginia Department of Taxation, for instance, over half of their workers now telecommute. They work from at home at least 3 days a week. And so one of the deurbanization features, suppose 5-10 years from now, over half the people in Norfolk are working from home. How is that going to change the type of housing units, literally, that you would have to be providing or you would want to be providing? So there's all sorts of issues. Sustainability is a big force. Moving more towards sustainability, or if there's a republic reaction and we don't continue the push towards sustainability. It'll make a big difference in what cities look like 10 years from now. So this is kind of fun. The students, this is second year MBAs. They enjoy doing this. We did ones on education, transportation, some social issues. We did the one on cities. We did one, actually, Shep, on a meteor hitting the Earth. Okay? One guy was working. They found there's more risk from comets than from an asteroid, rather. That it's a much bigger risk from comets than from an asteroid, so they looked at the properties of that, which I found very interesting. So, leaving you food for thought here, we'd suggest that you think about the idea of using what we have been looking at here is just a base, and then the status quo. Here's what you're doing now, and then look at 4 scenarios for 2020 of, okay, what might be the scenarios? What would Norfolk look like? What would the way people live and work look like in 2020? And you don't have to do this from scratch. The Rockefeller Foundation, for instance, has had 2 conferences with futurists and all sorts of experts from around the world on how will people live and work in 2020. In England, they've done a lot of this. England is shorter on land than we are. Counties and cities or areas in England have done a lot of work on what is housing going to have to be like in 2020. So it's a lot of fun. Would suggest you think about spending a little time on really brainstorming about the longer term future. Thank you.